Hi everyone, and welcome to my soldering tutorial, hopefully much improved from the last one. My last one wasn't very good because things were really hard to see. The information was good, but in practice it was difficult to see. So this time we're going to start out with tools, and we have a bunch of them here. Soldering tools. So we got several different types I'm going to show you here. This is your basic inexpensive little Weller soldering iron. It works fine. It's low wattages for what you want for doing circuit boards and things like that. A little bit higher wattage version of the same thing. You can see it's physically larger. We also have a torch type. This you basically fill with butane, that end. This is a little Weller. And then you just light it, and you got a flame that you use for soldering with. This is a nice soldering iron for doing circuit boards because it has a nice fine tip, as you'll see. The tip comes to a pretty good little point there. You know, it's a little hard to see with the background, but and the focus, but it's that nice sharp point that helps with that. And also, this box here is this is temperature controlled, so it's actually got a thermostat in it, and that helps it in several ways. This, in this case, goes with this, but it's basically a soldering iron holder, so you can put it down when it's hot. And this will serve two purposes. A regular soldering iron, such as one of these guys, not temperature controlled, no thermostat. If you leave them plugged in, they'll just heat up till they burn out. So don't forget and leave one plugged in. And you also don't want to leave it plugged in longer than you have to, because then you'll have to re-tin the tip, which we'll talk about in a moment. If you need some heavy duty soldering done, this guy is nice Weller soldering iron. And this particular one, model D550, has a duty cycle of 1 minute on, 4 minutes off. And it has two levels. It's a 260 or 200 watt. So these things are not left on continuously. The trigger activates it. You get one click or two. I'm actually, well, I hope that wasn't damaged. Anyway, one click gets the low level and the other click gets the high level going. And we'll show you that when we get to the soldering part. So you'll need an iron. You're also going to need some solder. It's a 60-40 tin lead combination, which is what you want for regular soldering, electronic soldering. A lot of times it'll say electronic solder. You want to make sure it has flux in it. This has 1.8% flux, and I'll explain about this. You can also buy an external container of flux, which is what this is. Lead-free tinning flux. By the way, you can get lead-free solder also. Just make sure it's for electronic solder and it has rosin core, because you can also get solder for torches and stuff that's made for different purposes. So this is our regular flux. Okay, so here we go. I focused in on the camera because I wanted you to see this tip. And you can see as I turn it how it's mostly shiny and nice. That's called a tinned tip, and that's what you need in order to do good soldering. Now, when you buy the soldering iron, the tip will be tinned. But if it's not, and after you use it, it gets dirt on it and stuff, the recommended procedure is to use some sandpaper or something and clean it off. A lot of times I use a tool and scrape it off and do all kinds of things. Probably aren't ideal. But it needs to be extremely clean. One thing about soldering is oxidation is your inner enemy. Excuse me, not your energy. Oxidation is your enemy. So you need to get it all cleaned off and nice and shiny. And then you need to tin it if it's not. If you scrape through to bare metal, it will rapidly oxidize when you turn it on and not be able to solder with it if it's oxidized. So clean it all off, and then the professional way to tin it, if you got a big shop, is you have a solder pot that heats up and you dip it in the solder, and then it's nice and perfectly tinned. Um, Most people don't have one of those and don't want to invest in one, and I don't. I've been soldering for years and I've never used one. Um, so what you do is you turn it on and you wait till it heats up just a little bit. And if it's totally untinned and in bad shape, you might want to dip it in a flux, like our flux I showed you earlier. There we go. Just kind of touch solder to it, and the smoke you see is the flux burning off. And you want to do this with solder with flux also. Now the purpose of the flux, pretend you didn't see that. The purpose of the flux is to clean the oxidation off. When you're soldering with it, it'll get in the end of the wire into the between the strands and help keep it clean for oxidation. So you want to make sure you don't have any oxidation on anything you're going to solder. Um, I also wanted to show you just real quick. I wanted to talk to you about wattage and stuff. So this goodie has two different levels. It'll heat to 260 or 200 watts, okay? I'm going to show you how long it takes to heat up. We'll see how long it takes before you can melt some solder. It won't be very long. I think it's like 1 minute or something. So the first click gets you the first heat setting, so the lights are lit up. So that first heat setting is 260 watts. Then you click it in further, so there's a little section where lights briefly go off and then further, and then you got the 260 watts going. Now you only want to do this for serious soldering. You never want to try to, see, we're already melting the solder. So it doesn't take it very long to do the job. You'd use this one not normally for just soldering and connecting two wires together. That big boy there is good for soldering. If you have to solder outdoors, you'll find that a regular soldering iron usually won't work. And a lot of times I've used these portable ones for that. And even at that, they don't get hot enough to counter for the slightest breeze. You got to keep them out of the slightest breeze. And I'd even recommend that for this big one. But I live on the coast and we have lots of wind all the time. So in that case, you'll want something this size. There are smaller ones, but if you're going to do it outdoors in any wind, I'd recommend this size. And or if you have really heavy wires with heavy insulation. But the problem with this thing is You need to solder things relatively fast, and you need to so that it doesn't burn the insulation. Okay, if the wires you're soldering are wires, and just don't use it on a circuit board unless you have some massive thing. There are some massive traces on things sometimes that you can't heat up with a regular iron. And for doing small things like circuit boards, you're probably looking at 40 watts. It seems to be my preference. 60 watts, maybe maximum. Um, this temperature controlled one here, I believe, is about a 60 watt max. But it's perfect for soldering on boards because that's what it's made for. Soldering something really heavy together, or trying to solder something crazy like solder baling wire together or something like that. If you just got huge chunks of metal, you might need one of these. If they're too huge, you'll just have to go to a torch. But these are at least the basic tools. And there's actually a couple of other things I wanted to get into. There are some other tools you might need. Okay, as you can now see, there's a bunch more stuff on the table there. Some stuff you might need depending on the job you're doing. So a lot of these you won't need depending on what you're doing. If you're soldering wires together, something like this, these are pre-cut pieces of heat shrink. And this is the insulation you'll put on the wires after you finish them. Don't use black tape. Black tape in many, many circumstances will come off. If it's not in a hot area and it's good black tape, and if it doesn't get any contact or rubbing against it, it'll usually stay put okay. But if you can avoid it, use heat shrink. Heat shrink makes a permanent and waterproof fix. This box was relatively inexpensive for what it was. I don't remember. I bought it. It's a fine little kit here. This Elect Fun. Just bought it off Amazon. Okay. For other things. So if you're doing wires, you might need to make sure they're neat. You always want to do proper wire maintenance and keep them neat. Otherwise, things will damage them. That's what these zip ties or the things are actually made for, not handcuffing people, but for tying wire bundles together. They work like this. Most people know this already, but you just zip them together. And then you use a pair of cutters to cut off the end. There you go. You're set up nice and neat. Your bundle of cables is all bundled up. Set of wire cutters. These are a set of crimpers. Oops, sorry. Helps if I hold those where you can see them. These are a set of crimp tools. So you put your crimp fitting in there and you crimp them. And it has a pair of snippers on the end, which is a good set of wire cutters. I also have a standard set of just wire cutters, which is better. So as far as cutting tools, this is a pair of end nippers. These are good for if you're working on a circuit board and you have a wire sticking through and it's just too long through a hole in the board. You want to snip it off. Clip end nippers. Of course, you don't have to have all of these, but these are how you do it right. You're going to need to strip the wire somehow. So, got these little pair when Radio Shack was in business, but they work like that. You have numbers on the dial here. Anyway, there it is. You can see it a little bit. See the numbers on the metal piece there. I guess this way's better. Yeah. There you go. 20, 22. Now you can see them. So those are the gauge of your wire. So you set that at the gauge of the wire you're using, and then and I guess I should get some wire, and I'll just show you that real quick. I'll show you how these wire strippers work. Now this is pretty thin. This is extremely thin. It's supposedly audio wire. Um, I would never use this as audio wire. It's too thin a gauge, and you have problems with too thin a gauge audio wire. The resistance in it causes problems. So, um, so we're going to set this, I'm guessing, about, we'll try 20 gauge. It's probably closer to 22. So you set this so that the little flat spot on it comes up there. And that says 22 there. So we're going to see. Yep, work perfect. There you go. That's how to use one of these little strippers. You know, set the indication to the gauge of wire. If you don't know the gauge of wire, start too large and come down into it. If you get too small of a gauge of wire, you'll end up cutting a bunch of the copper wires off, which of course is not what you're after. If you want to get on the fancy end of the spectrum, you have these, which I actually use the smaller ones more because they're simple and easy. These are good if you have a bunch of stuff you want to see where the sizes are. Gauges are. Can you see those on this? Yeah, a little bit. I guess I'm just holding it too close. You can see the gauges a little bit there, 2, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 gauge. So this one only goes to 16 gauge, so it won't really do anything smaller than that. So it closes like a clamp and will clamp on the end of the wire. So if you're going to strip this, put your wire in there and get the clamp on it. This thing will close down on it in the notch, and if it were the proper gauge of wire, would strip it. So they're fairly easy to use. You know, you'll figure it out. You get a pair from looking at it. Not that tough. So wire strippers of some sort you will need. In a pinch, you can use a pocket knife, especially if you don't do it much. It's bad for the pocket knife, and it's actually bad for the wire because it's too easy to nick the copper, and then it will break later. A lot of times it'll break after you soldered it together. It'll break if you nick it too much, things like that, and cause you problems. For forceps, just good for holding wire and things and reaching in, holding things in place. If you're working on circuit boards and the like, or even your soldering iron, there's these little nice wire brushes. You know, and something like this will be just about perfect for cleaning off a soldering iron end or cleaning off circuit board traces or the like. And yeah. Anyway, they have plastic ones so you won't damage stuff. It's good for some purposes. Little set of needle nose pliers, maybe. Very useful. Little screwdrivers, especially for working on the electronic stuff. A little screwdriver to take out screws with. This particular one has a magnet on the end to pick up stuff with. There is some caution needed with that under some circumstances because of the magnet. What else haven't we covered? This is just a chip extractor. If you extract a lot of chips, if you're working with chips, so you don't want to touch them by the pins. Though I see this all the time on YouTube, people on YouTube doing it, you don't want to touch chips by the pins. Never do that. And many times you won't notice any damage, but a tiny bit of static can damage the lifetime of a chip. And you may shorten that lifetime of the chip by a huge amount if you have a little static, even amounts small enough that you can't detect. And especially if it's something called CMOS, a CMOS chip, those are easily static damaged, especially the older ones, even more so. So Even though you see people constantly touching the chips as they're swapping op amps out in things in audio equipment, never touch the pins. There are ways to do things. One of the things you should always do when you're using a chip or when you're working with a chip, though I never see anybody do this, this is an anti-static strap. This goes on your arm. Okay, if you have to touch a chip, and usually for me it goes on my right arm because I'm usually doing things with my right arm. And then you attach the alligator clip to a ground connection. That way you're grounded when you're working with the chip. And if that's the case, you aren't going to have any static that's going to cause any damage to the chip, or transistors can be damaged this way also. So you need to use some caution, especially if you're going to be working with boards. There's a little more to it. Boards and components. This is just a little alligator clip, and you know, these things are used for all kinds of things, but in this case we've got it here for a heat sink. If you're working on a transistor or something that can be thermally sensitive, and many of them are, which means you don't want to overheat them and you're new to using a soldering iron. Now, I've never had a problem with damaging a transistor with a soldering iron, but you can clip this on the lead and it acts as a heat sink to absorb the excess heat from the lead. You still need to be fast when you're soldering components so you don't damage them. Several other things if you're working on components or boards. This is what's called desoldering braid. I got this from Amazon again a long time ago. I've been using it. Basically, you apply this with the soldering iron to what you're unsoldering, and the braid, if you keep plenty of flux in the braid, then it will suck the solder up through capillary action and wick the solder away so you can have an unsoldered component to remove. This is another device that does that. This is just a little bulb. You heat it up, you apply this to your connection, and you use it to suck the solder out of the connection. These guys were available from Radio Shack. This is still a Radio Shack one. I've had them forever and they tend to break after a while, but this is just a little suction device. You push in the plunger, you put that on your connection, you release the plunger, sucks the solder out. Okay, so those are some other tools you might be using. In the second part of the video, we're actually going to go into soldering stuff. That is a little device called Helping Hands. And just got two alligator clips on there. Real easy to work with. Basically, you just, for example, for holding a piece of wire I need to solder like these ones we stripped off, you know, you can do like this. Let's twist them together here. Just a quickie. That's not what we, I'd want to do it neater if we were actually soldering them, but the idea is just to get them ready and put them right in there. And that holds the connection where you can get to it and you can solder it. That's not too bad. We'll try and do some of these kind of close-ups for the soldering so you can actually see what's going on. That was one of the problems with my previous tutorials, was they had no close-up capability really. Okay, so that's it for part one. The next part will be actually soldering stuff and how to do it and how to go about that. Thank you for watching.